Welcome to the narrated step-by-step tutorial for my painting, Winter Barn. The photograph on the right was my inspiration for this painting. If you look closely, you can see some of the elements that I edited out of my final painting. If you look at the photograph, you'll see on the left-hand side at the top, there's a number of branches and edges of trees that somewhat frame this subject. I decided to leave those out in my interpretation of this scene. Also, there's a sapling that is growing by one of the first fence posts, and I opted to edit that out also in my interpretation. I begin with a light sketch on a sheet of 140-pound cold press Lanacora watercolor paper. I'm using a quarter sheet, so the dimensions are 11 inches by 15 inches. In my sketch, I've used a B pencil to draw the major shapes in the composition, such as the barn, the fence posts, some of the larger elements of the land, and an indication of where the trees are going. What I haven't done is drawn a lot of detail in indicating blades of grass or leaves or every branch on the trees. The colors that I'll be using for this painting are ultramarine blue, raw sienna, burnt sienna, quinacridone coral, sap green, and royal blue. The majority of the painting will be accomplished using ultramarine blue, raw sienna, and burnt sienna. Quinacridone coral will be used to help suggest the red tone on the barn, and the royal blue will be primarily used when I need some darker values. I'm going to begin by putting in a sky wash and some of the distant tree lines, and to do that I'm going to turn my board upside down so I can keep a nice crisp line where the tree line meets the snow-covered ground. I'm using a mixture of burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, with just a little bit of raw sienna in there, and it's leaning towards the warm side. So there's a larger proportion of the raw sienna and burnt sienna than there is the blue, which is keeping it warm. And I'm painting the sky, and also I've painted the shadowed side of the barn. And I'm just going to work this wash down and trying to keep a nice even wash. I'm using a 1-inch flat brush. This is a silverback black velvet brush, and I'm painting around the barn structure, leaving the light on the lit side there of the roof. The tone that I'm putting down is a light middle value. What I want to do is showcase the white of the snow, so I'm toning down much of the other areas in the composition so that the area where the snow is on the ground near the barn stands out more than if I left this a lighter tone or in some of the other areas that I'll be painting. When you're trying to cover an area this large with a flat wash, you want to make sure that before you begin you mix up a big pool of color in your palette so that you have enough to cover the area that you want and can maintain a consistent tone across the whole area. Now I'm going to begin to give the indication of this tree line. So I'm using the same mixture with the ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, and some raw sienna, but it's a little darker value. And you can see that I have two different mixtures here, one leaning towards the warm side and one leaning towards the cooler side. So towards the bottom I've started with a warmer tone, and then as it goes a little farther up I've got a cooler tone that I've introduced. So the cooler mixture has a little bit more ultramarine blue in it, and the warm mixture has more raw sienna and burnt sienna. So I haven't dried my paper after putting down the main wash, and the paper is still saturated, so it allows me to work wet into wet with as I put the indication of this tree line down. If I waited too long and the sky wash started to dry, and if I was in a in-between state of saturated and dry and the paper was just damp, I'd have problems if I was trying to do what I'm doing here, because I would start to get a lot of blossoms. But the paper is saturated enough that I can work wet into wet without getting any kind of blossoms or backwash. But if I'm not careful and I let an area dry and I go back into it, I could get some backwash or blossoms happening. So I completely dried my paper, and I've decided I want to have a little bit of a darker tone right there at the base of this tree line. So I'm coming in with a darker valued mixture, still using the same colors, and I'm just going to soften that edge up a little bit. And then I'm going to come around to the other side, and I'm going to do the same thing. So by working upside down as I establish the sky and the tree line, it's allowed me to keep a nice clean edge going the other way where the ground is snow covered. So here I'm going to do some of the same brushwork on this other side of the barn. I'm going to soften this edge as I did on the other side, but in this situation here I'm using a fine mist spray. So I could do this with just clear water using my brush, or I can use a fine mist spray as I have here. So here I've dried my paper completely, and I've turned the board back around so that the painting is right side up. And now I'm going to start to give the indication of a tree here in the background. That's just a large tree that stands out in front of this distant tree line. And to indicate this, I'm using a mixture of the raw sienna with some burnt sienna and sap green. I'm also going to use the same mixture with just a little bit of ultramarine blue in it to give me a cooler tone and a little bit of a darker value. So in this distant tree line, and in this tree in particular, I'm keeping it all rather in the mid-value range. I'm not going too dark because I don't want that to become a focal point. As I say that, this appears to be a very dark value because it is currently the darkest value in my painting against the half-white sheet of the paper. But once it dries, it'll lighten up, and then I'll be working in darker values in other areas, and it won't come across as a darker value. It'll be a mid-range value, mid to mid-dark value. Here I'm continuing with the same colors, raw sienna, burnt sienna, and ultramarine blue. And here I'm just giving the suggestion of the tree mass that's created, not by leaves, but just by the mass of branches and twigs that appear on a winter tree. So I'm just putting a wash down there just to give the suggestion of that volume, and I'm going to soften that up a bit with a spray. I'm going to put a similar wash here more toward in the background to suggest this large tree that's sitting back here behind this barn, using the same colors again and varying it between warm and cool. And once again, I'm going to soften that shape up by using a fine mist spray. So I'm using this soft shape in front of the barn to represent the tree, and the timing of when I do that's important because I can't paint the barn and then come back and try and put that soft shape on top. It'd be too late if I already have a lot of hard edges. So I have to put that soft shape in first, and then I start to paint the stronger colors and shapes of the barn around it. And to paint this barn, I'm using a combination still of ultramarine blue, raw sienna, burnt sienna, and then I'm going to use some touches of coral red, quinacridone coral at times to give it that barn, kind of that red barn tone. But I don't want to paint it just like a big red square. So I'll be mixing these various colors together and letting them mingle on the paper itself. Now I'm going to take a darker value and paint the shadowed side of this barn. Still using the same mixture or combination of colors, however, the mixture is a richer mixture with more pigment in it, so it's going to give me a darker value. As I paint this, I'll get a combination of grays and warm and cool tones depending on how I mix the paint, what the ratios are. And as I bring this wash down the side of this barn, I'm treating it as one wash, although I'm using multiple colors in it. So as I did just there, I'll have a little bit of the red tone, then I'll come back a little bit of the blue tone, and I'm letting those washes just merge one into the other to give a variety of color in this barn. Here I'm going to take a dark value mixture of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna and give the indication of some of these shapes that are in front of this barn. There's rolls of hay that are sitting there with snow sitting on top of the rolls. So there's some dark shadowed areas here, but I'm just going to paint these shapes, just giving them indication of what's there. I'm going to insert the photograph in the top right corner. One of the challenges is to describe the roll of the land here without having to render every piece of straw and stick and twig that's in the photo. So what I'm doing is I'm using my brush strokes and the direction of my brush strokes to help to suggest some of the contours of the land. Now there's a kind of a dip in this vegetation where this fence line's at. So I'm again using my brush strokes to try and describe the contour there and the roll of the land. And you can see that I'm using a variety of warm and cool tones as I paint this. And again, I'm continuing to work with the same colors, varying the ratio of the mixture to give me a warm or a cool tone. Now here I'm giving a suggestion of some of that warmer tone being picked up, kind of reflective light, and in some areas and shadowed areas in others. But my attempt here is to describe the contours of the flatlands versus the rolling areas and the masses that are formed by the vegetation and the grasses on the ground, and the surface or the contour of the land in that area from the fence post to the road has a slope. So I try to use again the direction of my brush strokes and the curved nature of some of the brush strokes to give a suggestion of that rolling vegetation. I'm going to use my brush strokes again to describe what's going on here. So I have these kind of muddy ruts in the snow that are on this road going up to the barn, and I'm using that brush stroke and that curved shape to describe that. And as I get farther out here, I'm going to start to go side to side with some of my brush strokes to help describe the contour that's in the foreground. And one of the things I'm trying to achieve is with the direction of these tracks is to lead the viewer into the picture and in towards the barn. Or I'm going to start to put a value on these fence posts. And I'm using a cooler tone towards the top and a warmer tone towards the bottom. And they're a dark middle value to dark value. And as I drew these in, I want to make sure that I don't end up with any tangents, and that there's variety in the shapes themselves. I don't want every post to look exact. I don't want them all perfectly straight up and down and all same width and length, and so the angles are varied a little bit, the heights are varied, although it's needs to carry the eye back in a manner that makes sense in terms of the height of these. And then the brush marks that I'm putting down vary on each of them. I'm going to take our darker value and just give a slight indication of tree trunks back in the distance. Now I'm going to paint the trunk and branches on this tree that's to the left of the barn. So this tree is sitting back behind the barn off to the left, but it's in front of the distant tree line. So this isn't part of that distant tree line. It's somewhere between the tree line and the barn, but fairly close to the barn. And I'm using a number 1 rigger brush, and I'm using a neutral tone here, a cool neutral tone that's mixed with burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. And now I'm going to work on the trunk and the branches of the tree that's in front of the barn. If you recall, when I mentioned at the beginning of the video about editing some elements out of the painting that from what's in the photograph, and one of those was a sapling that would have been beside this front fence post. I didn't like the positioning of it. I didn't think it added to the composition, so I decided not to put that in my painting. I want the viewer to be drawn back into the composition to the barn, and I want those whites that are surrounding the barn to stand out. And right now they're competing with all the whites that are in the foreground. So I'm going to take a middle valued wash that has a little bit more ultramarine blue in it, and I'm going to put it over the foreground area to tone that down a little bit, so that the white around the whites and lights around the barn and the white on the roof of the barn can stand out, and this foreground here gets toned down with this middle value wash. Here I've started to put a darker value on the shadowed side of this barn. And as I do this, I'm going to use a variety of colors, but it won't be as noticeable since it's such a dark value. But there will be variation in this dark wash that I'm putting down. It's a combination of the ultramarine blue with raw sienna and burnt sienna. And I'm also going to put in some quinacridone and coral. And if I applied this just as one dark gray, it wouldn't be near as interesting as it is when I work in some of the different colors. And like I said, it's hard to see because it's such a dark value, but there's some warm tones and cool tones working in there. And as I had mentioned earlier, when I painted the tree to the right, at the time it was the darkest value in my composition. But now that I've started to tone down some of the whites and I've started to paint some darker values, such as this, the side of this barn, this now becomes the darkest area. And that tree is allowed to fall a little bit farther into the background because it's a dark middle value, but this tone that I'm putting on the side of this barn is a very dark value, and it's going to be one of the darkest values in my painting. I'm continuing down the other side of this barn with a darker value, and I have a little bit more of a red tone in the mixture here. And I'm trying to, as I do this, still preserve some of the soft edges that were achieved when I initially gave the indication of that tree that's sitting in front of it. And it can be a difficult thing to do because it's very easy just to make it look hard-edged, and as you try to paint the value of the barn but still try and maintain some of that soft edge quality that was achieved earlier on in the painting process. As I finish painting this barn, you can see now that it's one of the darkest values in my composition, and it's positioned against the white of the paper, so I'm achieving the strongest value contrast right there around my focal point. And here I'm going to take a kneaded rubber eraser and I'm going to remove some of the pencil lines from my sketch. I'm going to work around some of the shadowed areas of this barn with a darker value, just trying to clean up some edges and provide some smaller dark value shapes. Here in front of the barn, I'm going to do some brushwork to give the indication of some dark value shapes, some smaller shapes here, just to provide some more interest and define a little bit more what's going on there, instead of just having a one big shape. A lot of times when I do some of this detail work here, as I get to the towards the end of my painting process, I like to use this quill brush, and I have that along with all the supplies I use listed on the studio page of my website. So if you want more information about the equipment and materials I use, you can always go to the studio page of my website where I have everything listed. But I like this quill brush because it holds a lot of paint and it keeps a fine point, so it's good for some of these finishing touches. I'm going to do the same thing in some of these areas of the snow and the ground cover here, just giving the indication of some dark valued marks. And again, as earlier, as I was painting some of these areas, the direction of my brush stroke is important because it helps describe the contour of the land. You can use curved brush marks to describe the rolling weeds, and you can use a linear horizontal mark to give the indication of a flat plane. I'm going to put a little darker value here on this path that's leading back. I'm going to take a warm mixture and put some on that tree shape there, just to help that out a little bit. I want to go a little darker in some of the foreground area here. So I'm taking a darker value and applying it over some of this foreground. And once again, I'm trying to use the brush strokes to help describe contours. As I paint this area here, I'm trying to use my brush strokes just to suggest the grassy nature of that foreground area. I'm going to take my brush strokes here to try and describe the roll of the grass that's kind of fallen over here as it comes from the fence post to the ground. And then take some brush strokes that go horizontally across this area here to describe that plane. Here I'm going to tone down some of this flat field area here with this darker tone. And I want to take a little bit of this darker wash and put it over that tree line a little bit. I'm going to soften that edge, but just to help further define the edge of that snow and make it stand out a little bit more. I'm going to take my rigger here with a light gray tone and just give the indication of the wire on that fence. So I don't want it to be so strong that it just looks like a ruled line going across the page, but just enough to let the viewer know that there is a fence there, not just a post. Going to take my quill brush with a very dark value. This has royal blue in it. Royal blue is a color I like to use when I need a dark value. It mixes well with some of the other colors and gives a nice dark value. But I'm just making some small brush marks in a few areas just to clean up some edges and just to create a little bit more interest in some areas and break up some larger shapes. Going to take that dark value along the lower half of the front side of that barn to suggest some shadow areas. As I reach the end of my painting process, keep in mind that this was a fairly limited palette. Most of the painting was done with burnt sienna, raw sienna, and ultramarine blue. And as I put a white mat on here, you can get a good look at it. That's my painting, Winter Barn. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you haven't already, be sure to check out Rick Surowicz Watercolor Friends and Subscribers on Facebook. And as always, if you have questions about the materials or equipment I use, you can always go to the studio page on my website, rsurowitzart.com. And if you have specific questions, you can email me at contact@rsurowitzart@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.